Watch how fast she smiles when I tip her." The men at the table laughed softly as crystal glasses clinked beneath the golden lights of Valmont Steakhouse, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants where a single bottle of wine could cost more than most Americans paid for rent in a month. Ethan Calloway leaned back in his leather chair with the effortless confidence of a man who had spent most of his life being obeyed. His charcoal suit looked perfectly tailored against his broad frame, and the silver Patek Philippe on his wrist caught the amber chandelier light every time he lifted his glass. Across from him, two executives from Dubai exchanged polite smiles, while pretending not to notice the arrogance woven into his voice. Ethan switched to Arabic again, lowering his tone just enough to make it feel private. "Americans hear another language and immediately assume intelligence," he said with amusement. "Meanwhile, she's probably wondering if sparkling water comes with free refills." More laughter followed. Quiet, casual. The kind of laughter powerful men used when they believed nobody around them mattered enough to understand. Claire Bennett heard every word. She stood beside the table holding a bottle of San Pellegrino against her black apron, her expression calm as she refilled the glasses one by one. She didn't react, didn't blink, didn't tighten her jaw. That was the first thing unusual about her. Most people reacted to Ethan Calloway. They straightened their posture, smiled too quickly, tried too hard. Claire simply moved with quiet precision, like someone whose thoughts existed somewhere far beyond the dining room. Ethan barely looked at her. To him, she was part of the background. The soft piano near the bar, the low jazz humming through hidden speakers, the muted glow of Manhattan through rain-covered windows 30 floors below. Another invisible piece of the evening designed to make wealthy people comfortable. "Sir," Claire said softly, setting down the final glass, "your guests requested the reserve menu." Ethan nodded absently without looking up from his phone. One of the Arab executives studied Claire for a moment before speaking in fluent Arabic. Fast, natural, impossible for most Americans to follow. Ethan smirked immediately. He understood enough to recognize the joke. "Careful," the man had said. "She looks smarter than your board members." Ethan laughed under his breath and answered in Arabic without hesitation. "That's not difficult." This time the laughter was louder. Claire adjusted the silverware beside the table with steady hands. Then, without warning, she answered in flawless Arabic. "Actually," she said gently, her pronunciation smooth and elegant. "He said your board members remind him of men who confuse confidence with wisdom. Silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind that arrives so suddenly it feels physical." One of the executives nearly dropped his glass. Another stared openly at Claire as if his brain needed several seconds to process what had just happened. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes from his phone for the first time that night. The room around him seemed to blur for half a heartbeat. Claire met his gaze calmly. No anger, no triumph, just stillness. Then she offered a polite smile and added in perfect Arabic, "Would your guests prefer the imported saffron butter now, or with the main course?" Ethan froze completely, because the shocking part wasn't that the waitress spoke Arabic. It was that she sounded like someone who belonged in rooms far more powerful than his. The silence around the table lingered several seconds too long. Even the piano near the bar seemed quieter somehow, as if the entire restaurant had leaned in without realizing it. Ethan Calloway stared at Claire Bennett while the reflection of city lights flickered across the untouched whiskey in his glass. He had spent years negotiating billion-dollar acquisitions with presidents, investors, and foreign ministers without ever losing control of a room. Yet somehow a waitress in a black apron had just dismantled his confidence with one calm sentence and a polite smile. Claire remained perfectly composed. "The saffron butter will pair better with the lamb," she said softly in Arabic to the guests. "The chef imported it from Morocco this morning." One of the executives blinked in surprise before answering her enthusiastically. Ethan understood enough Arabic to follow the exchange now, but he no longer felt in control of it. That realization irritated him more than he wanted to admit. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" he asked suddenly. Claire turned toward him slowly. "Speak like what, sir?" The question was polite. Too polite. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly. "Arabic." Claire folded her hands neatly behind her back. College? That is not college Arabic. One of the executives interrupted with a smile. That accent comes from someone who lived around native speakers. Claire hesitated for the first time all evening. Just briefly. A tiny pause most people would never notice. Ethan noticed immediately. You lived overseas? He asked. For a little while. Her answer came carefully measured, like someone choosing which truths were safe to reveal. Before Ethan could press further, another server hurried across the dining room toward their table, visibly nervous. Claire, the young man whispered urgently. Table 12 says their translator is wrong again. Claire's expression shifted almost invisibly. Calm. Focused. She glanced toward a private dining room near the back of the restaurant where raised voices could now be heard through the partially open doors. One of the managers rushed past carrying folders, his forehead covered in sweat. Ethan recognized the signs instantly. A deal was collapsing. The Arab executive beside him sighed quietly. Translation errors destroy trust faster than bad contracts. Ethan looked back toward Claire. Go help them, he said before thinking. She seemed surprised by the suggestion. Sir, you clearly know more than whoever they hired. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment, uncertain. It is not my place. Ethan almost laughed at the irony. 5 minutes ago he would have agreed with her completely. Now he found himself irritated that she was pretending to be smaller than she actually was. Another burst of tension echoed from the private room. Someone inside spoke sharp Arabic followed by frustrated English. Claire inhaled slowly. Then she placed the silver serving tray against her hip and walked toward the doors with quiet confidence. Ethan watched her cross the restaurant floor beneath the chandelier light. Every movement was controlled, elegant without trying to be, the kind of composure people usually spent years pretending to have. One of the executives beside Ethan smiled faintly. Interesting woman. Ethan did not answer immediately. Through the glass wall of the private dining room, he could see Claire speaking softly to a furious client, while nervous executives sat frozen around the table. Then something strange happened. The angry man stopped talking. His shoulders relaxed. A moment later, several people around the table actually smiled. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair, unable to look away. Because for the first time that night, he realized Claire Bennett had not been embarrassed when he mocked her earlier. She had pitied him. For nearly 20 minutes, Ethan Calloway forgot about his own table entirely. The imported whiskey sat untouched beside his phone, while rain streaked slowly down the massive windows overlooking Park Avenue. Inside the private dining room, Claire Bennett moved through the conversation with quiet control that made the expensive executives around her look strangely nervous. Ethan could not hear every word through the glass, but he did not need to. He understood enough Arabic to recognize precision when he heard it. Claire was not translating mechanically. She was navigating personalities, calming tension before it escalated, correcting misunderstandings without embarrassing anyone involved. That required more than vocabulary. It required intelligence. One of Ethan's guests leaned closer and lowered his voice. She is protecting both sides from losing face. Ethan glanced toward him. What do you mean? Most translators simply convert words. She understands culture. The executive smiled faintly while watching Claire speak. That is much harder. Ethan looked back toward the room. Claire stood beside the head of the table, holding a leather folder against her waist while several businessmen listened to her with complete attention. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody looked at their phones. In a city where billionaires competed to dominate conversations, Claire somehow controlled the room without raising her voice once. A few moments later, the private dining room doors opened. The atmosphere had changed completely. The same clients who had looked furious earlier were now laughing quietly while shaking hands with relieved executives. One older man stopped beside Claire and spoke to her warmly in Arabic before placing his hand over his heart in gratitude. Claire smiled politely but kept her eyes lowered, almost uncomfortable with the attention. Ethan watched her return toward the main dining floor beneath the soft gold lights. Several employees stared openly as she passed. One hostess whispered something to another server. The manager near the bar looked both relieved and deeply confused. Claire simply picked up a serving tray and resumed working as though none of it mattered. Ethan stood before he realized he was doing it. "Claire." She turned calmly. "Yes, sir?" Up close, Ethan noticed details he had ignored earlier. The faint shadows beneath her eyes. The tiny ink mark near her wrist from a leaking pen. The silver necklace tucked carefully beneath her uniform collar. Nothing about her looked careless. Everything looked temporary, like someone intelligent passing quietly through a place she never intended to stay. "Sit down for a minute," Ethan said. Claire blinked once in surprise. "I am working." "So am I." Ethan gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "And right now I have questions." One of the executives smirked knowingly while sipping espresso. Claire hesitated before finally sitting with visible reluctance. Even seated across from him, she remained composed. Back straight, hands folded lightly in her lap. Ethan studied her carefully. "How many languages do you speak?" Claire looked almost amused by the question. "Enough." "That is not an answer. Neither was your Arabic earlier." One of the executives nearly choked on his coffee, trying not to laugh. Ethan stared at her several seconds before something unexpected happened. He smiled. Genuinely. Not the polished business smile he used for investors and magazine covers. A real one. Claire noticed immediately and looked slightly caught off guard by it. "You enjoy making people uncomfortable, do you?" Ethan asked quietly. "Only arrogant people." Her answer came soft as rain against glass. Ethan should have been offended. Instead, he found himself leaning closer, curious in a way he had not felt in years. Because every person in his world wanted something from him. Access, money, tension. Claire Bennett seemed to want absolutely nothing at all. And somehow that made her impossible to ignore. Claire stood from the table the moment another server appeared beside her carrying a tray of smoked salmon appetizers. "Table 9 is asking for you," the young waitress whispered nervously. Claire nodded immediately and rose from her chair with smooth professionalism, as though the conversation with one of the most powerful men in Manhattan had been nothing more than another task between orders. Ethan watched her disappear back into the rhythm of the restaurant. The strange thing was not her intelligence anymore. It was the way she carried it. Most brilliant people he knew treated intelligence like a performance. They interrupted others, corrected grammar, dominated conversations to prove superiority. Claire did the opposite. She concealed her mind the way wealthy people hid money offshore. Quietly, deliberately. Ethan leaned back slowly while his guests resumed discussing investment projections. But his attention kept drifting across the dining room toward her. Claire moved between tables beneath the warm chandelier light with practiced calm, balancing heavy trays effortlessly while listening to customers with complete attention. An elderly woman near the windows smiled as Claire adjusted her scarf gently around her shoulders before refilling her tea. At another table, a nervous young couple visibly relaxed after Claire said something that made them laugh softly. She seemed to understand people within seconds. That unsettled Ethan more than he cared to admit. "You are staring," one of the Arab executives said quietly with amusement. Ethan glanced toward him. "I am thinking." "Dangerous thing." Ethan almost smirked. "You think she is hiding something too?" The executive swirled espresso slowly in his cup. "No. I think she is hiding from something." The observation lingered in Ethan's mind longer than it should have. Across the restaurant, Claire disappeared briefly through the kitchen doors before returning with fresh menus tucked beneath her arm. Ethan noticed the exhaustion in her eyes now. Tiny details he would normally never bother seeing. The faint stiffness in her shoulders. The careful way she flexed her fingers between tables when nobody was watching. She had probably been on her feet for 10 hours already. Yet she never lost composure, never rushed, never complained. Another businessman approached Ethan's table then, interrupting his thoughts. "Calloway," the man said enthusiastically. "I heard you almost lost the Al Noor deal tonight." Ethan barely looked at him. "Almost. Lucky save." The man laughed lightly while glancing toward Claire, Who knew your waitress had a Harvard-level language degree? Ethan's expression cooled immediately. She is not my waitress. The man blinked awkwardly before excusing himself. One of the executives across the table raised an eyebrow subtly. Ethan ignored him. Rain continued sliding down the windows behind the skyline, while soft jazz floated through the restaurant like smoke. Somewhere near the bar, glasses clinked softly. The entire room glowed gold and silver beneath the city lights, but Ethan suddenly felt disconnected from all of it. For years, he had believed intelligence belonged to people like him. Educated men in tailored suits sitting at polished tables discussing markets and acquisitions over $1,000 dinners. Yet tonight, the sharpest person in the building had been carrying plates through crowded aisles while wealthy men failed to notice her. Claire approached his table again carrying the check folder. Your guests requested the car service be moved to the south entrance, she said softly. Ethan looked up at her. Do you ever stop working? Claire gave the faintest smile. Not in Manhattan. The answer sounded simple, but something inside it felt heavy. Ethan studied her another moment before asking quietly, Why are you really here, Claire? Her eyes met his fully for the first time that night. Calm blue-gray beneath the chandelier light. Same reason everyone is, she said gently. To survive New York. Then she walked away before he could ask another question, leaving Ethan staring after her, while the rain fell harder against the glass. By 11:30, the dinner crowd at Valmont Steakhouse had thinned into the quieter rhythm of late-night Manhattan. The finance executives were gone. The tourists had disappeared into black SUVs and glowing hotel lobbies. Only a few scattered tables remained beneath the soft amber chandeliers while rain continued washing silver streaks across the windows overlooking the city. Ethan Calloway should have left an hour ago. His driver had already texted twice asking whether to circle the block again. Important emails waited unanswered on his phone. Tomorrow morning included a 7 o'clock conference call with Singapore investors followed by a board presentation downtown. Normally, Ethan treated time like currency. Every minute scheduled. Every interaction calculated. Yet somehow he still sat alone at table 16 with a glass of melting ice beside him, watching Claire Bennett wipe down empty tables at the far end of the restaurant. She had changed slightly after most of the guests left. The professional smile appeared less often now. The exhaustion she carried all evening settled more visibly into her posture. But there was something else too. Relief, perhaps. Like someone finally allowed to breathe after performing for hours beneath bright lights. Ethan noticed she hummed quietly while stacking menus near the host stand. Arabic music. Soft and melancholy. One of the bussers approached her carrying a broken espresso machine part. Claire crouched beside the counter immediately and examined it with focused attention before adjusting something small with a butter knife. Seconds later, the machine started working again. The busser stared at her in amazement. Claire simply smiled and returned to work. Ethan shook his head slightly to himself. Languages. Negotiation skills. Mechanical instinct. The woman was an entire mystery hidden beneath a black waitress uniform. You are still here. Claire's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Ethan looked up to find her standing beside his table, holding the final check folder. Apparently, Claire glanced toward the nearly empty restaurant. Most billionaires are usually gone before dessert. Most billionaires do not get publicly humbled in Arabic before coffee. For the first time all evening, Claire laughed. Not loudly, just a soft, unexpected laugh that seemed to warm the cold edges of the room. Ethan found himself staring at her again. The sound surprised him more than her language skills had. There, Claire said quietly while setting the check folder down. That expression. Ethan frowned slightly. What expression? The one where you look confused because someone spoke to you honestly. Ethan almost smiled again. You always analyze people this much? Claire adjusted the strap of her apron thoughtfully. Only people who pretend not to care what others think. Ethan leaned back slowly. Most people in his world feared silence. They filled rooms with meaningless conversation to avoid uncomfortable truths. Claire used silence differently. Like a mirror, she allowed people to reveal themselves naturally. You still have not answered my question, Ethan said. Which one? Why are you working here? Claire's eyes lowered briefly toward the silver watch on her wrist. Old, scratched, clearly sentimental. My mother used to say New York punishes people who dream too slowly. Ethan waited quietly. Claire looked toward the rain outside before continuing softly. Sometimes life changes direction before you are ready. The answer carried enough sadness to stop Ethan from pushing further. Across the room, the manager called Claire's name and handed her a folded envelope. She thanked him politely before slipping it into her apron pocket without opening it. But Ethan noticed the tension immediately returning to her shoulders. The quiet calm disappeared from her expression for just 1 second. Fear. Real fear. Claire quickly masked it and turned back toward him. You should go home, Mr. Calloway. Ethan studied her carefully. And you should stop pretending everything is fine. Claire's face stilled completely. The city lights reflected in her eyes while rain whispered softly against the glass behind them. Then she gave him a tired smile that looked far older than she was. That trick works on other people, she said gently. Not on me. Claire turned away before Ethan could answer, disappearing through the swinging kitchen doors with the same controlled composure she carried through every room. But Ethan could not stop thinking about the look in her eyes when she slipped that envelope into her apron pocket. It had not been embarrassment. It had been worry, deep enough to crack through the calm mask she wore so carefully. Ethan remained seated while the restaurant staff cleaned around him. Chairs scraped softly across marble floors. Glassware clinked in distant racks behind the bar. Outside, Manhattan glowed silver beneath the rain like a city refusing to sleep. 10 years ago, Ethan would have left without another thought. Someone else's problems were not his responsibility. That philosophy had helped him build Calloway Ventures into a multi-billion-dollar empire before the age of 40. Efficient people survived. Emotional people drowned. Yet tonight something felt different. Maybe because Claire had spoken to him without fear. Maybe because she had looked at him like a human being instead of a walking balance sheet. Or maybe because for the first time in years, Ethan sensed someone carrying burdens heavier than his own success. The kitchen doors opened again. Claire emerged wearing a long charcoal coat over her uniform while loosely tying her scarf around her neck. Her hair had fallen slightly from its neat bun now, soft strands catching the warm light above the entrance. She looked exhausted, beautiful in the quiet, unguarded way real life sometimes created accidentally. Ethan stood immediately. Claire noticed him and sighed softly. You are still here. Apparently neither of us likes going home. Claire reached for the register receipts beside the hostess stand. You should not make assumptions about people you barely know. Ethan slipped one hand into his coat pocket. Then help me know. Claire paused briefly before shaking her head. That line probably works very well for billionaires. Not tonight. She looked at him carefully then. Not impressed. Not intimidated. Simply studying him the same way she studied everyone else. Why does this matter to you? She asked quietly. Ethan considered the question honestly. The answer unsettled him because he did not fully understand it himself. Because everyone in this city performs, he said finally. Investors perform confidence. Executives perform intelligence. Politicians perform sincerity. His eyes met hers steadily. You do not seem interested in performing anything. Claire's expression softened for the first time all evening. Just slightly. That is because life gets expensive when you pretend to be someone else. Before Ethan could respond, her phone vibrated sharply inside her coat pocket. Claire checked the screen and all color drained from her face. Fear again. Immediate and real. She turned away quickly while answering in a hushed voice. Ethan only caught fragments. I know. No, please do not cancel it. I can pay part tonight. Silence followed while Claire listened. Her shoulders tightened beneath the coat. I understand, she whispered finally. Thank you. She lowered the phone slowly after the call ended. For several seconds, she simply stood there staring at nothing while rain tapped gently against the windows behind her. Ethan stepped closer instinctively. Claire. She blinked once and forced composure back into place. I am fine. No, you are not. Her laugh came soft and tired. You really are not used to hearing the truth, are you? Ethan ignored the remark. What happened? Claire hesitated. The city lights reflected across the moisture gathering in her eyes, though she refused to let the tears fall. My younger brother needs another surgery, she admitted quietly. And hospitals in New York do not accept intelligence as payment. Ethan felt something inside him shift painfully. Not pity, respect. Because even now she stood straight beneath the weight of it instead of collapsing under sympathy. Claire pulled her scarf tighter around her neck and reached for the restaurant door. Good night, Mr. Calloway. But before she stepped into the rain, Ethan spoke again. Claire. She turned slowly. Ethan's voice lowered. Steady. Serious. Let me help. The restaurant door opened with a soft chime as cold rain swept briefly across the marble entrance. Claire stood frozen beneath the glow of the lobby lights, one hand still gripping the brass handle, while Manhattan shimmered in silver behind her. Ethan's words lingered between them heavier than either expected. Let me help. Most people would have answered immediately. Gratitude. Relief. Maybe tears. Claire Bennett simply looked tired. You cannot buy your way into every problem, Mr. Calloway, she said quietly. Ethan stepped closer, his voice calm. I am not trying to buy anything. Claire studied him carefully, as if searching for hidden motives beneath expensive fabric and practiced confidence. Outside, headlights reflected across rain-soaked streets while distant sirens echoed somewhere downtown. New York never truly slept. It only changed moods. You barely know me, Claire said finally. That has not stopped me from recognizing intelligence. Intelligence is not the same as trust. Ethan nodded slightly. Fair point. In his world, trust usually came attached to contracts and legal teams. Yet standing there beneath the warm entrance lights, he realized Claire's distrust was not cynical. It was earned. Then do not trust me yet, Ethan replied softly. Just let me help your brother. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. Ethan noticed how tightly her fingers pressed against the strap of her bag. Pride, fear, exhaustion. She had probably spent years surviving by refusing to owe anyone anything. The surgery is $90,000, she admitted quietly. Even with insurance. Ethan did not react. $90,000 was less than what several men at dinner had spent on watches tonight. But he understood immediately why it felt impossible to her. Claire laughed faintly, though there was no humor in it. See? That silence right there. Ethan frowned slightly. What silence? The billionaire silence. Her tired smile returned briefly. The one where rich people try not to look shocked by numbers ordinary people drown under. Ethan looked down for a moment before answering honestly. I am not shocked by the amount. Claire's eyes hardened slightly. Of course not. I am shocked you have been carrying this alone. That answer caught her off guard. Ethan saw it immediately in the way her expression softened before she carefully rebuilt the walls again. You do not understand, she whispered. Maybe not. Ethan slipped off his coat slowly and draped it over the back of a nearby chair. But I know what it looks like when someone has spent too long believing they have to survive everything by themselves. Rain tapped steadily against the glass doors while the last bartender dimmed lights near the empty dining room. The restaurant suddenly felt smaller now. Quieter. More honest. Claire stared toward the street outside. My father used to say accepting help creates debt. Ethan leaned against the hostess stand thoughtfully. Your father was probably trying to protect you. Claire smiled sadly. He died trying to protect all of us. Ethan remained silent. Some grief announced itself loudly. Claire's grief sat quietly beneath every sentence she spoke. What happened to your brother? Ethan asked gently. Car accident 3 years ago, Claire answered after a pause. Spinal damage. Multiple surgeries. She looked down briefly. He was supposed to start college this year. Ethan noticed the way her voice changed when speaking about him. Softer. Protective. Like every sacrifice in her life had slowly rearranged itself around keeping her brother alive. And you gave up school. Ethan said quietly. Claire did not answer immediately. She simply reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a worn student identification card before handing it to him. Ethan looked down at the faded Columbia University seal beneath her photograph. Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures. Academic Honors Program. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes back to hers. Claire shrugged lightly, almost embarrassed by it now. Turns out hospitals do not accept scholarships either. For the first time in years, Ethan Calloway felt ashamed of how small he had once believed waitresses could be. The rain had softened into a fine silver mist by the time Claire and Ethan stepped outside the restaurant. Manhattan shimmered around them in blurred reflections of headlights and neon signs, while cold winds swept between the buildings carrying the distant sound of taxis and late-night traffic. Claire pulled her coat tighter against the weather as Ethan handed her student identification card back carefully, almost respectfully. "You kept this," he said quietly. Claire looked down at the worn Columbia card in her hand. "I was supposed to graduate 2 years ago." Ethan noticed the way she said supposed to. Not bitter, just tired, like someone who had spent too long making peace with disappointments nobody else ever saw. A black town car rolled smoothly to the curb beside them. Ethan's driver stepped out immediately with an umbrella, but Ethan waved him back. Claire noticed the gesture and looked faintly surprised. Most wealthy men she had met preferred staying untouched by weather, inconvenience, or discomfort. Ethan simply stood beside her beneath the rain like it no longer mattered. "Where is your brother now?" he asked. "St. Vincent's Rehabilitation Center in Brooklyn." Claire glanced toward the glowing city streets. "I visit after every shift." Ethan checked the time automatically out of habit. Nearly midnight. Claire had probably worked 10 hours already and was still heading across the city afterward. "You take the subway there?" Claire smiled faintly. "You sound offended by public transportation." "I sound practical. The subway is practical." Ethan looked at her worn shoes, still damp from earlier deliveries through the rain. "Not at midnight in Manhattan." Claire tilted her head slightly. "You really are trying to help." "I told you I was." She studied him quietly beneath the city lights. Ethan sensed her trying to decide whether kindness from someone powerful always came with conditions attached. Honestly, he could not blame her for doubting it. In his world, generosity often functioned like investment capital. Nobody gave without expecting leverage later. "Why?" Claire asked softly. Ethan frowned slightly. "Why what? Why does this bother you so much?" He looked out toward Park Avenue where yellow taxis moved like streams of gold through the rain. For a moment he considered giving the polished answer. "Because you are talented. Because it is the right thing to do. Because nobody should lose their future over money." But none of those felt fully true anymore. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Because tonight I realized something embarrassing." Claire waited silently. "I built an entire career around evaluating people," Ethan said. "Investments, executives, partnerships." His eyes returned to hers. "And within 30 seconds of meeting you, I underestimated you completely." Claire's expression softened almost invisibly. "Most people do. That does not make it acceptable." Rain tapped gently against the black car beside them while steam curled upward from subway grates nearby. Ethan suddenly remembered his own mother standing in hospital hallways years ago after his father died. The exhaustion in her eyes. The pride that refused help even when everything was collapsing financially around them. He had not thought about those memories in years. "My mother worked 3 jobs after my father passed away," Ethan admitted quietly. Claire looked genuinely surprised now. Billionaires were not supposed to sound human. "I spent most of my 20s trying to become rich enough that nobody in my family would ever feel powerless again." He gave a faint, humorless smile. "Somewhere along the way I forgot what powerless actually looked like." Claire stared at him several seconds without speaking. Then, very softly, she said, "Money changes people." Ethan nodded once. "Sometimes it just reveals them faster." For the first time that night, Claire did not look guarded, just sad, and strangely understood. Ethan opened the rear passenger door of the town car slowly. "Let me take you to Brooklyn." Claire hesitated while cold rain shimmered around them beneath the Manhattan lights. Then finally, with visible reluctance and quiet exhaustion, she stepped inside. The drive to Brooklyn took nearly 40 minutes through wet midnight traffic. Manhattan slowly faded behind them in rivers of blurred gold and silver, while the black town car moved quietly across the bridge beneath low clouds and steady rain. Inside the car, silence settled naturally between Ethan and Claire. Not awkward silence. Not forced conversation. Just two exhausted people staring through different windows while New York carried on around them. Ethan noticed Claire watching the city carefully as they passed late-night grocery stores, glowing diners, and crowded subway entrances filled with people trying to make it home before morning. She looked at the city the way survivors looked at storms. Not with admiration, with endurance. "You do this every night?" Ethan asked softly. Claire nodded while keeping her eyes on the rain-covered glass. "Work until midnight. Visit my brother. Sleep a few hours. Repeat." Ethan shook his head slightly. "That is not sustainable." Claire smiled faintly. Most families living in New York are one emergency away from impossible choices. Ethan had spent years reading economic reports about ordinary Americans. Healthcare debt, housing pressure, student loans. But reports were numbers on conference tables. Claire made those numbers human. The car finally stopped outside St. Vincent's Rehabilitation Center, a modest brick building glowing softly beneath the rain. Ethan stepped out first and held an umbrella above Claire while they crossed the wet sidewalk together. Inside, the hospital smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Quiet television sounds echoed from distant waiting rooms while tired nurses moved through the hallways beneath dimmed lights. Claire immediately relaxed slightly the moment they entered. Ethan noticed it right away. This place mattered to her. A nurse near the desk smiled warmly the second she saw Claire. "You made it." Claire nodded gratefully. "How was he tonight?" "Stubborn," the nurse answered with a laugh. "So probably improving." Claire smiled for real this time. Not guarded. Not careful. Ethan realized then how rarely she allowed herself happiness. They walked quietly down the hallway together until Claire stopped outside room 214. Through the partially open door, Ethan saw a young man sitting upright in bed with headphones around his neck and several textbooks spread across his lap. Early 20s. Thin from months of recovery but alert-eyed and intelligent. Claire's face softened instantly. "That is Daniel," she whispered. Ethan noticed something in her expression he had not seen all evening. "Peace. You should go in," Ethan said quietly. Claire hesitated. "You do not have to stay." "I know." She studied him carefully one more time before slowly opening the door. "Daniel." Her brother looked up immediately and smiled. "You are late. Blame Manhattan." Daniel laughed softly before noticing Ethan standing behind her in an expensive dark coat. "Either you got promoted," he said carefully, "or New York just became very confusing." Claire rolled her eyes lightly. "Daniel, this is Ethan Calloway." The reaction was immediate. Daniel nearly sat forward too quickly before stopping himself. "The Ethan Calloway?" Ethan stepped inside with a small nod. "Hopefully the less disappointing version." Daniel stared at him in shock. "Claire hates billionaires." "Daniel." "What? You do?" Ethan glanced toward Claire with quiet amusement while she looked suddenly embarrassed for the first time that night. "She has made that relatively clear." Daniel laughed again before wincing slightly from the movement. Claire instantly moved beside him, adjusting his blanket and checking his medication cup without even thinking about it. The motion was automatic, protective, loving. Ethan watched silently from near the doorway while fluorescent hospital light reflected softly against the rain outside. Suddenly the entire night made sense to him. The extra shifts, the exhaustion, the hidden brilliance buried beneath restaurant uniforms and late subway rides. Claire Bennett had not abandoned her future because she lacked talent. She had sacrificed it because someone she loved needed her more. And standing there in a quiet Brooklyn hospital after midnight, Ethan realized something else too. The smartest person he had met in years was never trying to impress anyone at all.